Garrett Sloan snatched the bundle right out of her hands, not gently, not with any hesitation. He grabbed it the way a man grabs something he's already decided doesn't matter, and he threw it into the dirt at her feet. "You think we're running a soup kitchen out here?" he said, loud enough for every man in that yard to hear. "Look at you. You can't even feed yourself." The laughter that followed wasn't quiet. It rolled across the yard like something mean and alive, and every single man joined in, because that's what men do when someone else gives them permission. Maren Holloway did not bend down to pick up her bundle. Not yet. She just stood there in the dust, her chin level, her eyes going nowhere, her hands absolutely still at her sides. And that stillness, that refusal to collapse, was somehow the most defiant thing anyone on that ranch had ever seen. If that were you, what would you do? If this kind of story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We release powerful stories like this every week, and you won't want to miss a single one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to 1886 and the day one woman walked into a place that didn't want her and quietly saved every soul in it. The summer of 1886 did not forgive weakness. It had been cooking the plains of the Oklahoma Territory for 3 straight months, turning creek beds into cracked mud and green grass into something that crumbled between your fingers. The kind of heat that didn't care what you needed or who you were. It just pressed down, relentless, like a hand flat against the top of your head, daring you to straighten up. Maren Holloway felt that hand every step of the last 4 miles. She had started the morning with half a biscuit and a swallow of water from a canteen that tasted like rust and desperation, and by the time the silhouette of Blackbriar Ranch appeared through the shimmer of heat rising off the land, she had been walking for 7 hours without rest. Her boots, the left one splitting along the outer seam, had rubbed the skin off the back of her right heel 2 days ago. She hadn't stopped walking then either. She was 51 years old, and she moved like a woman who had learned long ago that slowing down didn't help anything. It just gave pain more time to find you. Blackbriar Ranch was not an impressive thing to look at. It was a collection of weathered structures arranged around a central yard. A main house that had probably been handsome once, 2 long bunkhouses, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, as if it had been listening too long for something to come from that direction. Fence posts ran out in both directions and disappeared into the flat distance. Cattle moved beyond the far fence line, slow and heat-stupid. A water pump stood in the center of the yard with a tin cup hanging from a nail in the post beside it. That pump was the first thing Maren looked at when she walked through the gate. She made herself walk past it. She had learned years ago, long years, hard years, years that had worn grooves in her the way a rope wears grooves in a post, that you don't show a new place what you need first. You show it what you have. What you need comes later if you earn the right to need it. There were 8 men in the yard when she arrived. Some were working or doing the slow version of working that heat permits, mending a harness here, moving a crate there, doing just enough to justify standing in the shade of the barn overhang. A few were sitting on the bunkhouse steps, hats tipped forward, half asleep in the way men get when the day has taken everything and given nothing back. She heard the change before she saw it, that particular silence that falls over a group of people when something unexpected walks in. A conversation stopped, then another, then the sound of someone straightening up in the dirt, boot heels scraping. Maren kept walking toward the main house. She made it about 30 feet before the voice stopped her. "Hey now, where do you think you're headed?" She turned. The man coming across the yard toward her was broad through the chest, somewhere in his late 30s, with the particular walk of someone who had been in charge of other men long enough to forget that not everyone answered to him. His face was sun-dark and square-jawed and wore an expression she recognized immediately, the expression of a man who had already made up his mind. This was Garrett Sloan. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't need to. She had met this man 100 times in 100 different places. He was a type, and the type was not kind. "I'm looking for the owner of this property," Maren said. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect after 7 hours of walking. "I'd like to speak with him directly, if that's possible." Sloan stopped a few feet away and looked her over, the way a man looks at a horse he's already decided isn't worth buying. Slow, dismissive, almost bored. His eyes moved from her face to her boots, to her travel bundle, to her face again. "It's not," he said. "I'm sorry?" "It's not possible. Mr. Mercer's busy, and you need to turn yourself back around and head out whatever way you came in." He crossed his arms. "We don't have anything for people passing through. No spare food, no spare work, no spare charity. So—" "I'm not asking for charity," Marin said. "Looked like you were." "Then you looked wrong." Something shifted in Sloane's face. Not quite anger, not yet, but the thing that lives just before anger. The flat-eyed attention of a man who isn't used to being corrected by someone who looks like she does. He unfolded his arms slowly. "Is that right?" he said. "I cook," Marin said. "I've cooked for wagon trains, mining camps, cattle drives, and one riverboat that I don't recommend for the faint of stomach. I'd like to offer whoever runs this ranch one meal, prepared by me, at no cost. If he doesn't find it worth keeping me on, I leave at sunrise. That's the whole proposition." Sloane stared at her for a moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He laughed, not a small laugh, a full, open, deliberate laugh, and he turned his head so the men behind him could see his face doing it, could know they had permission to join. They did. It started with the two men closest, a rolling, easy laughter, the kind that costs nothing and means less. And then it spread outward through the yard the way laughter always spreads when someone decides another person is ridiculous. She could feel it on her skin like something physical. She had felt it before. That didn't make it easier to stand inside. She had just decided to speak again when the thing happened. The thing she would think about later, in the quiet of the kitchen, when her hands were busy and her mind could wander. Sloane stepped forward and grabbed her travel bundle. Not to examine it, not out of curiosity. He grabbed it the way a man grabs something he has already decided is irrelevant, and he threw it into the dirt at her feet with a flat, conclusive sound, like he was making a statement he didn't feel required words. "You think we're running a soup kitchen out here?" he said. Loud, deliberate, performing for the yard. "Look at you. You can't even feed yourself." The laughter got louder. Marin looked at her bundle in the dirt. Then she looked up at Garrett Sloane. She did not bend down. Not yet. She kept her hands still and her chin level, and she looked at him with an expression that was not anger. It was something quieter and more dangerous than anger. It was the look of a woman keeping a very careful accounting. She would not forget this moment. She filed it away behind her eyes with the careful patience of someone who has learned that the people laughing at you today have a way of needing you tomorrow. "Are you finished?" she said. Sloane blinked. He had expected tears, maybe. Or retreat. Not that. "Mr. Sloane." The voice came from the direction of the main house. Low, tired, carrying the specific weight of a man who has not slept properly in some time. Marin turned. Thaddeus Mercer was a leaner man than she'd have expected for a ranch this size, somewhere north of 50, with silver at his temples and the kind of deep-cut lines around his eyes that come not from age alone, but from worry sustained over years. He was standing on the porch with a cup of coffee he hadn't drunk, watching the scene in his yard with an expression that was hard to read. Not amusement, not quite disapproval, something more complicated, like a man watching something familiar play out, and not entirely sure whether to stop it. "What's the situation?" he said. It wasn't exactly a question. "Nothing worth your time," Sloane said. "Drifter asking for a handout. I was just sending her on." "I made an offer," Marin said, and she directed it at Mercer without raising her voice, without any of the performance that Sloane had just put on. "One meal, no cost. If it doesn't satisfy, I go at sunrise. If it does, I'd like to discuss terms for staying on as cook. I understand you don't have one currently." Mercer looked at her. He looked at Sloane. He looked at the bundle in the dirt and then back at her face, and something passed across his expression that Marin couldn't fully name. She would understand it later. She would understand that Thaddeus Mercer was standing in that yard with 4 men planning to leave by the end of the week, a cook who had quit in June and taken the last of the good flour with him out of spite, and a sense of quiet desperation that he was working very hard not to show. "What did you say your name was?" he said. "I didn't yet. It's Marin Holloway." He was quiet for a moment. The yard was quiet. Even the laughter had stopped, replaced by the kind of watching stillness that falls over a group when the person in charge is doing something unexpected. "You said 1 meal," Mercer said. "That's right. And if it doesn't satisfy, I leave at sunrise. You won't have lost anything but the supplies it took to cook it, and I'll work within whatever you've got. I won't ask for extra." Mercer looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. She had learned that too. That looking away reads as guilt or weakness, and she was neither guilty nor weak. She was hungry and tired, and she had a split boot, and she was standing in the yard of a stranger who had just thrown her belongings in the dirt. And she was also the best frontier cook alive in the Oklahoma Territory in the summer of 1886, and she knew it, even if no one else did yet. "All right," Mercer said. "Sloan, show her the kitchen." Sloan's face went through something complicated. "Thad, show her the kitchen," Mercer said, and went back inside. The yard held its quiet for another moment. Then Sloan turned to Marin with his jaw set and his eyes doing that flat, mean thing eyes do when a man is angry and knows he can't show it directly. "This way," he said. Marin bent down and picked up her travel bundle without hurrying. She dusted it off with 2 careful strokes. Then she followed him. She heard one of the men behind her say something low, and a couple of others laugh again. Quieter this time, uncomfortable, the way people laugh when they're less sure of the joke. She didn't turn around. The kitchen was around the back of the main house, accessed through a narrow door that stuck and required Sloan to hit it with his shoulder before it gave. He stepped aside and let her enter first, and she walked in and stopped and took in what she was dealing with. It was not good. The space was functional but depleted. A long, scarred work table down the center, a cast iron range along the back wall that had not been properly cleaned in some time, shelves that held considerably more empty space than supplies. She could see immediately that the previous cook had not been careful with the stores, or the stores had been going into too many meals for too many weeks without being replenished. Probably both. She set her bundle on the table and began moving along the shelves, touching things, checking, her mind already running calculations the way it always did in a new kitchen. What's here? What can be built from it? What will the men need? What can I make them believe they want? "You're looking at a near-empty larder," Sloan said from the doorway. He said it with satisfaction, like it proved something. "Previous cook cleaned us out, so if you're thinking of running some miracle on us—" "Stale flour," Marin said, not turning around. She was looking at a sack in the corner. "Yeah, I told you. How stale? 2 weeks or 2 months? Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal." She pulled the sack open and put her hand in and felt the flour, and brought some out and pressed it between her fingers and smelled it. 2 weeks, she said. "This is still workable." She kept moving. Dried beans, mostly black-eyed peas in a large clay pot. A salt pork end that had been forgotten on a lower shelf, so she almost missed it in the shadow. A small bunch of dried herbs hanging from a nail near the window, half dead but not fully. She knew those herbs. She had grown that same combination on a wagon train once, learned it from a woman who had learned it from her mother who had learned it somewhere further back than any of them could remember. She found a jar of molasses pushed to the very back of the highest shelf. It was nearly empty, but not quite. She found 6 eggs in a cracked clay bowl, covered with a cloth that had seen better years. She found dried corn. She found a tin of lard that was about a third full. She found onions, drying and a little soft but not gone, in a crate on the floor. She straightened up and looked at the range. She walked to it and opened the firebox and looked in, and then looked back at the firebox and then at the woodpile beside it, which was adequate. She checked the flue pole. She tested the surface temperature with her palm held an inch above the iron. "Well," Sloan said. He was still in the doorway. He hadn't moved. She understood he had positioned himself there so he could watch her fail and report it accurately. "I'll need a bucket of water from the pump and someone to build this fire up," she said. "After that, I'll do the rest alone." "You're serious about this?" She looked at him. "Mr. Sloan, the only thing I'm doing right now is cooking supper for your crew. Everything you're concerned about is outside the kitchen door. Let me do my work." He looked at her with that flat-eyed expression for a moment that stretched long enough to be deliberate. Then he pushed off from the doorframe. "I'll send the kid for your water," he said. "Don't expect anything else." "That's all I asked for." she said. He left. She stood in the kitchen alone and let herself breathe for a moment. One breath, two. The kind of breathing you do when you've been holding yourself together in front of people and need a private second to check if you actually held. Her heel hurt. Her hands were shaking very slightly, which she hadn't allowed herself to notice while anyone was watching. She was hungrier than she had been in years. She put her hands flat on the work table and pressed until the shaking stopped. Then she started to work. She pulled the flour sack to the table and began the process of evaluating it properly. Not just by feel, but by smell, by color, by the way it moved when she shifted a handful from palm to palm. She had cooked through worse. The spring of 1873, east of Fort Laramie, she had made biscuits from flour that had been wet and dried and wet again, and the men eating them had not complained because the alternative was hardtack that could chip a tooth. She thought about those men sometimes. She thought about a lot of people she had cooked for over the years. Miners with blackened hands, too tired to chew slowly, shoveling food like they were filling a hole rather than feeding a person. Families crossing the plains with everything they owned packed into a wagon, children who ate what she gave them with enormous quiet eyes, soldiers who didn't say much but came back every night, gamblers and drifters and homesteaders and men running from things they didn't name. She had fed all of them. Not one of them had stayed. That was the thing about being a cook for people in motion. You became necessary, and then you became the thing they left behind. Camp would break, wagon would roll, ship would dock, and Maren Holloway would stand at the edge of where she'd been and watch people go somewhere she wasn't going, and then she'd pick up her bundle and start figuring out where she was going next. She'd been doing that for a long time. She was very tired of it. The door opened and a young man came in carrying a full bucket of water in each hand, moving carefully to avoid sloshing. He was probably 19, maybe 20, slight through the shoulders but with the beginning of ranch muscle showing in the way he moved, the careful balance of someone who had been doing physical work long enough for it to change his body. He had a young face that was trying very hard to look older than it was. He set the buckets down with the particular care of someone who has been told to be useful and is taking that seriously. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm Jonah Pike." "Maren Holloway," she said. "Thank you for the water." He nodded. He should have left. He stayed. She felt him watching her as she began to measure the flour. Not on a scale, she didn't have one, but in her hands, by feel, the way she'd been doing it for 30 years. She knew what a pound of flour felt like in her palm. She knew what a cup of lard felt like between two fingers. These were not measurements she had learned from a book. "You really cooked for wagon trains?" Jonah said. "7 of them," she said. 2 cattle drives. Various other situations I won't detail before supper. Sloan says you can't make a meal out of what's left in here. Sloan says a lot of things. Jonah was quiet for a moment. "He's usually right," he said, but his voice carried something underneath that. A reluctance, maybe. A desire for something to be different. "Hand me that salt pork in," she said, "and we'll find out." He brought it to her. She took it and examined the cut end and ran her thumb along the rind and nodded to herself. Then she looked at him. "You can stay if you don't talk too much," she said. "I think clearer when I can hear the stove." He nodded once, carefully, like she'd given him something fragile to hold. She turned to the range and started building her fire with the focus of a woman who has no margin for error and knows it, who knows that in some hours' time every man on this ranch will sit at a table and either believe in her or not, and that what she did in this kitchen in the next few hours was the only argument she had the right to make. She had been making that argument her whole life. She intended to win it this time. The fire caught. The iron began to warm. Through the single window above the work table, she could see the light in the yard starting to lean toward afternoon gold, the way light does when a summer day finally starts to think about becoming evening. She heard voices outside, men talking, the particular low murmur of people who are speculating about something. She knew what they were speculating about. Let them, she thought. She picked up a dried bean and turned it in her fingers for a moment, small, hard, unpromising. She put it in the soaking pot and reached for another. She had until supper. She had done more with less. She did not intend to fail. The fire had been going for 20 minutes before Maren let herself think about the beans. That was the order of things in a kitchen like this. Fire first, always, because everything else depended on it. A cook who started her beans before her fire was ready was a cook who'd be serving raw centers at supper and wondering why the men weren't coming back for more. Marin had made that mistake exactly once, in the spring of 1869, on a wagon train 2 weeks out of Missouri, and the memory of it still lived in her hands as a kind of muscle-level warning that activated before her conscious mind even had to think about it. She had drained the beans and set them in the heavy pot with enough water to cover them by 2 inches. Not 3, not 1.5, 2 inches exactly, because she was working with a range she didn't know yet, and she couldn't afford to guess wrong on evaporation rate. She dropped in the salt pork end whole, because you get more out of salt pork when you leave it in one piece and let the fat work slowly into the liquid rather than cutting it up and letting it dissolve too fast and leave you with greasy water instead of flavor. Jonah Pike was still in the kitchen. He had positioned himself on a low stool near the door, close enough to watch, far enough that he wasn't in her way, and he was doing something with a piece of leather and a small knife that was probably mending, but mostly was an excuse to stay. She had noticed this about him in the first few minutes. He was the kind of young man who wanted to see things happen. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, careful way, like someone who had learned that most of the world moves too fast and the interesting parts happen in the margins if you're paying attention. She didn't mind him. He didn't clutter the air with noise the way some people did. "You're not going to season those yet," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "The cook we had before, Henny, he always salted things right at the start." "Henny was wrong about salt pork beans then," she said. "The salt's already in the pork. You add more at the start, you toughen the skins, and they never get soft in the middle no matter how long you cook them. You get beans that taste like they're disagreeing with you." Jonah considered this. "Henny's beans did always disagree with us," he said. "Most people don't connect the cause with the effect when it comes to cooking," Marin said. "They just know something's off, but they can't say what. So they blame the ingredients instead of the method." She was moving to the flour as she said this, already thinking 3 steps ahead. The flour needed to be worked with the lard before it rested, and it needed to rest before it could be shaped, and she was calculating backward from the time she estimated supper would need to be ready, mapping the evening like a river she had to navigate upstream. Too many cooks thought of a meal as a series of separate tasks. Marin had always thought of it as a single continuous piece, like music, where everything was connected to everything else by timing. She worked the lard into the flour with her fingers. It was not elegant work. Her knuckles were already stiff from the morning's walk, and the kitchen was hot enough that the lard was softer than ideal, which meant she had to work faster than she liked to keep it from becoming greasy. She could feel Jonah watching her hands. "You learned all this on the wagon trains," he said. "I learned the foundation of it from my mother," she said. She could make a meal out of almost nothing. I watched her do it so many times that when I got old enough to cook myself, I didn't have to think about most of it. My hands knew before my head did. She pressed the heel of her palm into the flour mixture. "The wagon trains just taught me to do it fast, under pressure, with people depending on it. That's a different kind of learning." "Different how?" She thought about it for a moment, genuinely. She appreciated that he asked things as if he actually wanted the answer. "When you learn in a comfortable kitchen with plenty of supplies and no one hungry yet, you learn the recipe," she said. "When you learn on a wagon train with 20 families who haven't eaten properly in 3 days and a fire that won't stay lit in the wind, you learn the principle behind the recipe. The principle doesn't fail you when the recipe can't be followed." Jonah turned this over quietly. The leather thing in his hands had stopped moving. "Is that why you came here?" he said. "Because you needed somewhere to use what you know?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he had the grace to look slightly uncertain about having asked, like a young man who's realized he may have stepped somewhere he wasn't invited. "I came here because I needed supper," she said. "Same as everyone else." She turned back to the dough. The truth was more than that, and they both understood it. But Marin had not survived 51 years by explaining herself to strangers, and Jonah seemed to understand that the line had been drawn without her having to mark it in any obvious way. He went back to the leather. She went back to the flour. Outside, she could hear the yard. The men had not dispersed. That much was clear from the intermittent sound of voices and the occasional laugh that carried through the kitchen window with the particular quality of people who are entertaining themselves at someone else's expense. She heard Sloane's voice once, not the words, just the tone, the performative certainty of it, and she set her jaw slightly and pressed harder into the dough, and then made herself ease up because overworked dough toughens the same way oversalted beans do, and she could not afford either mistake tonight. She thought about what Garrett Sloane's face had looked like when he threw her bundle in the dirt. Not the expression of a cruel man, exactly. She'd known cruel men, and they had a different quality to them, something colder and more deliberate. Sloane's face had been the face of a man performing cruelty for an audience, which was a different thing, and in some ways more dangerous, because a man performing needs the performance to succeed and will escalate to protect it. A truly cruel man doesn't need anyone watching. Sloane needed the yard to laugh. She filed that away too. The beans were starting to simmer. Not a full boil, which she didn't want yet, but the low, lazy bubbling that meant the heat had found them and was beginning its slow work. She adjusted the pot slightly on the range, moving it to a cooler spot on the iron to keep the simmer where she wanted it, and then she checked the smell. Salt pork releasing. Good. The fat was going into the liquid the way she needed it to. She went back to the dough and shaped it. Not biscuits, not yet. Those would go in last, close to serving, because a biscuit is only worth eating in the first 20 minutes out of the oven, and she was not going to serve this crew a cold biscuit and let that be the last impression of the evening. She wrapped the shaped dough in a clean cloth from her travel bundle. She always carried 2 clean cloths, always. This was not negotiable. And set it to rest. She started on the corn. Dried corn needed to be cracked and cooked low and long, and she didn't have the time for that in the traditional way, which meant she had to think about it differently. She had done this before, in tighter situations. She cracked the corn coarser than you'd want for proper hominy, soaked it in hot water from the kettle while she worked on other things, and set it to cook in a separate small pot with a careful eye on the liquid level. "What's that going to be?" Jonah asked. "Something between a porridge and a pudding," she said, with the molasses stirred in at the end, served alongside the beans. He looked at the jar of nearly empty molasses she'd set on the table. "There's not much left in there." "There's enough," she said. "The point isn't to sweeten the corn into something unrecognizable. The point is to give it a note, something that makes the men think they're eating something better than they are." She paused. "Not to deceive them, to give them something to taste beyond the corn itself." Jonah looked at the pot, then at her. "That's a kind of trick," he said. "Everything a good cook does is a kind of trick," she said. "The difference between a good trick and a bad one is whether the person being tricked ends up satisfied." He thought about that for a while. She let him think. The afternoon was moving. She could feel it in the light coming through the window. The gold was deepening, leaning toward amber, which meant 2 hours to supper if she was going to have it ready when men expected it, which was important because hungry men waiting for a meal that's late become resentful men, and she did not need to serve a resentful audience tonight. She started on the onions. They were soft and dry-skinned, and 2 of them had spots she had to cut around, but the flesh underneath the bad spots was still good, and she worked through them quickly, her eyes watering, not from any emotion, just from onions, which make no distinctions. And she got them into the small iron skillet with a piece of the lard and started them slow because you cannot rush an onion, and you cannot fake the smell of an onion properly caramelized. That smell, she knew, would do half her work for her before anyone tasted anything. The human nose remembers things the brain forgets. She had watched it happen on every wagon train, every cattle drive. Men who said they weren't hungry straightening up when a certain smell reached them. Men who said the cook was no good filling their plates anyway when the kitchen started talking to them through the air. Appetite is partly in the stomach and mostly somewhere older than that, somewhere that doesn't listen to opinions. She was counting on that tonight. The door opened without a knock. It wasn't Jonah. He was already in the room. And it wasn't Mercer, whose footsteps she'd noted on the porch once and cataloged as a heavier tread than this. This was a lighter step, quick. And the man who came in was wiry and sun-browned with restless eyes that moved over the kitchen and landed on her with an evaluating look that was different from Sloane's. Less dismissive, more curious, like he was genuinely trying to work something out. "Smells like onions," he said. "That's because there are onions," Marin said without turning from the skillet. "Huh." He leaned against the door frame. "Sloane sent me to check if you needed anything." "Sloane sent you to see if I was doing anything worth reporting," she said. A short silence. Then the man laughed. A genuine laugh, surprised out of him. Well, yeah, probably. I'm Decker. Marin Holloway. I know. News travels on a ranch. He looked at the pots, the dough resting on the table, the organized arrangement she'd made of the sparse supplies. She could feel him recalibrating something. You've actually got things going in here. Did you expect otherwise? Honestly, Sloan had us pretty convinced you'd poke around and then come out and ask for a meal and $1.50 and a ride to the next town. I already told your crew leader what I was offering, Marin said. I don't negotiate the same terms twice. Decker nodded slowly. He looked at Jonah, who gave him a small shrug that communicated something between them the way long familiarity does. Then he looked back at the stove. Those are our last beans, he said. Not a complaint, exactly. More like a man taking note of how deep the water had gotten. I know, she said. I worked with what I found. And if it's not good? She stirred the onions. They were starting to turn, the edges going translucent and gold, the smell intensifying into something that filled the room with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Then I leave at sunrise, she said. That was the agreement. Decker watched her for another moment. The agreement was Mercer's idea, he said. Sloan would have just sent you off. I know that too, she said. Does it bother you? What Sloan did? Out in the yard. She was quiet for a moment. The onions sizzled. The beans murmured in their pot. Through the window, the evening was deepening, the sky going from amber to a burnished, tired orange at the edges. What bothers me, she said finally, is irrelevant until after supper. After supper, I can afford to have feelings about things. Right now, I have a meal to finish. Decker looked at her with an expression she'd seen before. The look of a person encountering something they didn't entirely expect and not sure what to do with the information. Then he pushed off from the doorframe. I'll tell Sloan everything looks fine, he said. You can tell him whatever you like, she said. It won't change what comes out of this kitchen. He left. Jonah watched the door close and then looked at Marin with something that might have been admiration if he were a few years older and more practiced at showing it. You're not afraid of any of them, he said. I'm afraid of plenty of things, she said. Running a bad supper is one of them. Running out of time is another. Garrett Sloan is not on the list. She moved the onion skillet off the direct heat and let them rest, and while they rested, she checked the beans. They needed more time. The skins were still firmer than she wanted, and she adjusted the heat upward by a fraction and put the lid on at a slight angle to let some steam escape and keep the simmer even. She checked the corn, which was softening nicely, and stirred it with the long wooden spoon and tasted it off the back of her wrist. She never tasted directly from a spoon she was cooking with, another habit from years of feeding people who needed to trust that the cook had some standards. And it needed more time, but was going the right direction. She started thinking about the biscuits. The timing of the biscuits was the most critical piece of the whole evening. Everything else could sit and hold. Beans only get better as they rest. The corn could be kept warm. The onions would go into the beans in the last 20 minutes and disappear into the flavor the way good supporting work always disappears into the final result. But biscuits were unforgiving. You made them last, you put them in hot, you pulled them the moment the tops went golden and not a minute after, and you got them to the table while people were still on their first plate. The margin was approximately 12 minutes. She had built tighter margins than 12 minutes. She thought about the herbs. The dried bundle hanging near the window was sage and something else. She'd identified it on first inspection, but wanted to verify. She crossed to it and took it down and broke a small piece and rubbed it between her palms and breathed in. Wild thyme. Oklahoma Territory. Wild thyme had a different quality than the domestic kind she'd used back east, earthier, less sharp, with a warmth underneath that worked better in bean dishes than the European variety did. Whether that was the soil or the altitude or just the particular stubbornness of a plant that had to work hard to survive out here, she couldn't say, but she'd learned it years ago and she wasn't going to ignore it now. She stripped the thyme carefully from its dried stems and crumbled it between her fingers into a small pile on the table. Then she did the same with the sage. Just a little of that, because sage has opinions and too much of it can override everything else in a dish and make it taste like you're eating a decision rather than a meal. Those herbs were Henny's, Jonah said. I figured. He never used them. She looked at the small piles on the table. Why not? Said they tasted like weeds. They're weeds, she said. That doesn't mean they taste bad. She swept them into her palm and crossed to the bean pot and lifted the lid and let them fall in, then put the lid back and moved on before Jonah could ask anything else. The light through the window had gone fully amber now, the particular heavy gold of an Oklahoma summer evening that made everything look warmer than it was. She could hear the men in the yard more clearly, more of them now, the workday winding down, the gathering that happened every evening before supper, when men drifted toward the main area without consciously deciding to, pulled by habit and hunger and the human need to not be alone at the end of a day. She heard Sloane's voice again, still performing. Mercer's going to feel stupid about this by morning, he was saying. She could make out the words now through the window, the evening air carrying them clearly. One meal. What's one meal going to tell you about whether somebody can actually do the work? A murmur from someone she couldn't identify. I'm telling you, she's going to come out of that kitchen with something barely edible, and Mercer's too soft-hearted to send her off tonight, so we'll be stuck feeding her until morning, and then she'll be gone, and that'll be 2 days of supplies we could have... Marin stepped away from the window. She did it deliberately, the same way she'd made herself walk past the water pump when she arrived. Because what Sloane was saying wasn't her business right now, and she couldn't afford to let it become her business until the work was done. The anger was there. She could feel it in the back of her throat, the hot, tight feeling of a person who has heard too many versions of this exact conversation across too many years. Too many rooms she wasn't supposed to be in. Too many jobs she'd already been decided against before she started. Too many moments of being looked at and found lacking before anyone had tasted a single thing she'd made. She pressed her palms flat on the work table. She had 1 hour. She picked up the wooden spoon. The beans were ready for the onions. She could smell the depth in them now, the pork fat fully integrated, the dried thyme and sage having opened up in the liquid the way dried herbs do when they've been given enough time and enough heat, releasing oils that had been locked in since the plant dried on its stem. She tipped the onions in. All of them, every bit of the caramelized, golden, sweet, savory mass, and put the lid on for the last sustained simmer and turned to the corn, which was ready for the molasses. She used every bit of the molasses, scraped the jar with the wooden spoon, and then turned the jar over the pot and waited. And what came out was thin but fragrant, dark and faintly sweet, and she folded it into the corn with long, slow strokes and tasted again. Better, much better. The corn had a warmth to it now, a roundness. And she covered that pot too and turned to the biscuits. The dough had rested well. She could feel it in the way it gave under her hands. Pliable, not fighting her, the lard distributed evenly through the flour, so that when she pressed it flat and began cutting it with the rim of the tin cup that was the closest thing to a biscuit cutter the kitchen had to offer, the edges were clean and held their shape. She counted 14 biscuits. Enough for every man to have one, and for the hungrier ones to have 2 if they moved fast. She laid them on the baking pan with a 1/4 inch between each one, not touching, because biscuits that touch each other steam instead of bake, and you lose the crust. And the crust is the whole point of a biscuit when the inside is what fills you up and the outside is what makes you want it in the first place. She slid them into the oven. 12 minutes. She set the bean pot to its final low simmer, uncovered the molasses corn and gave it one last stir, and then she stood at the work table and let herself breathe, and that was when Thaddeus Mercer knocked on the kitchen door. He was the only one who had knocked. She noticed that. "Come in," she said. He opened the door and stood in the frame rather than entering, which she understood as a consideration. This was her space now, at least for tonight, and he was observing that without being asked to. He looked at the pots, the biscuits in the oven, the organized emptiness of the work table with the scraps cleared and the surfaces wiped. His expression was hard to read as it had been in the yard, but she thought she saw something shift in it. "Smells different in here," he said. "Different from what?" "From what it smelled like when Henny was cooking." He paused. "Better." "Henny didn't use the herbs," she said. Mercer looked at the empty nail by the window where the bundle had hung. He seemed to recognize it as an observation worth noting. I didn't know we had those, he said. Most people don't notice what's in a kitchen unless it's missing, she said. Not unkindly, just true. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, she could hear the men, more of them now, closer to the building. The gathering tightening the way it does when supper is close, and the body knows it before the clock says so. Sloan thinks I made a mistake, Mercer said. Sloan thinks a lot of things, she said. In about 10 minutes, you'll have more information than you do right now. He almost smiled at that. It didn't quite arrive, but the edge of it was there. You're very direct. I've been alive long enough to know that being indirect mostly wastes time I don't have, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way Sloan had looked at her, not the assessing look of a man calculating what she was worth. More the look of someone encountering something solid and unexpected and trying to determine its dimensions. How long have you been cooking professionally? He said. Since I was 23, she said. 28 years? And before that? My mother's kitchen, she said. And before that, watching my mother's kitchen. She paused. I've been in a kitchen my whole life. I just haven't always been paid for it. He nodded. She could see him working towards something, a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask yet. She waited for it. Why do you need this? He said finally. A place like Blackbriar. Not a town, not somewhere there's more people. Why here? She looked at him. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated and long and touched on things she was not prepared to lay out in a stranger's kitchen with biscuits in the oven. I need somewhere that needs me, she said. It was true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Somewhere I can be useful past breakfast. Mercer held that for a moment. Then he nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when he's decided something internally but isn't ready to say it yet. Supper in 10 minutes? He said. In 12, she said. Tell them to wash their hands. He left. She turned back to the oven and got down on one knee, her bad knee, the one that had been complaining since mile 3 of the morning's walk. But she needed to see through the oven door, and this was the only way, and looked at the biscuits. The tops were starting to turn. Not ready. Almost. She stayed where she was and watched them and thought about nothing except the color change happening in that iron oven, the way pale dough goes first to cream and then to gold, and then, if you're not careful, to something that disappoints. And she watched the edge of the change happening across the tops of 14 biscuits and breathed slowly and waited. Jonah, who had been so quiet for the last 20 minutes that she'd half forgotten he was there, spoke from his stool. They're going to be surprised, he said quietly. The men, even if they're not ready to show it. She didn't look away from the oven. Why do you say that? Because it already smells like something that takes a long time to learn to make, he said. And most of these men have been eating like they were already halfway to leaving. She heard something in that, the way a person says something true about others that is also true about themselves. She filed it away. The biscuits were gold. She reached for the oven door. The moment she pulled the pan out, the smell that had been building in the kitchen for the past 2 hours amplified into something that couldn't be contained by walls. She knew it would go through the gaps in the door and the window and out into the yard the way it always did, because that was what a meal cooked with attention always did. It announced itself before you could see it, reached people in that old wordless place before opinion could form and decide against it. She heard, through the window, a pause in the conversation outside. Then the sound of someone standing up. She set the biscuits on the cooling rack and stood up straight, her bad knee registering its protest, and she took the long wooden spoon and lifted the lid from the bean pot and stirred once, slow, and the steam that rose was thick and dark and fragrant with pork and thyme and caramelized onion and the deep, patient flavor of beans that had been cooking long enough to become something more than beans. She put the lid back. She looked at the kitchen, at the ordered arrangement of pots, the biscuits steaming gently on the rack, the supplies she had arrived to find nearly empty and had turned into something she was not ashamed of. She looked at the empty herb nail and the scraped molasses jar and the flour sack that was considerably lighter than it had been. She thought about the morning, the walk, the boot, the yard. Garrett Sloane's hands on her bundle, the weight of it hitting the dirt, the laughter rolling out across the yard like something that knew exactly what it was doing. She thought about every place she had cooked and left, every fire she had built in a kitchen that wasn't hers, Every meal served to people who ate and moved on. She thought about Mercer's question, "Why here?" "Because I am 51 years old and I am tired of being temporary," she thought. "Because I have been useful my whole life and I have never been allowed to stay." She said none of this. She straightened her apron and picked up the serving spoon and looked at Jonah Pike, who was watching her with that careful, quiet attention he'd had since the beginning. "Go tell them it's ready," she said. He stood up from his stool, and she noticed that he was smiling, just slightly, just at the edges, the controlled smile of a young man who thinks something good is about to happen and doesn't want to say so in case he's wrong. He went out the door. She listened to his footsteps cross the yard. She listened to the quality of the silence that followed the words she couldn't quite hear. She picked up the first pot and carried it to the serving table, and then she went back for the second, and then for the biscuits, moving with the efficiency of a woman who has done this 1,000 times and understands that the meal doesn't end when the cooking does. It ends when the last person has eaten, and not a moment before. The door opened. The first man through it was not Sloane. It was a man she hadn't met yet, older, with a gray beard and careful eyes. And he stopped just inside the door and looked at the table and breathed in, and something in his face went quiet and simple, the way faces do in the presence of something they recognize without being able to say what it is. He picked up a bowl. He served himself without a word. The second man came in behind him, and then a third, and the sound of the room began to change, shifting from the cautious shuffle of men who expected to be disappointed to something slower, more deliberate, the sound of people settling in. Marin stood at the far end of the room, her hands folded in front of her, and watched them come. The gray-bearded man's name was Cutter, and he ate the way a person eats when they have stopped expecting food to be anything more than fuel. He sat at the far end of the long table and put a spoon into the beans and brought it to his mouth and chewed once, twice, and then he stopped. Not because something was wrong, because something was right, and his body needed a second to catch up with the information. He chewed again, slower, and set his spoon down on the table with a careful, almost reverent click, and looked at his bowl like a man who has just been reminded of something he thought he'd lost for good. He didn't say anything. He picked up his spoon again and kept eating. Marin watched this from the corner of the room and said nothing. The others filed in behind him, 4 men in the first wave, then 2 more, then a young hand she hadn't seen yet, who couldn't have been more than 17, and who loaded his bowl so full that the beans threatened the rim, and he had to carry it with both hands, and the focused attention of someone carrying something genuinely precious. Nobody was talking. That was the first sign. Men who expect a bad meal talk through it, filling the air with noise to cover the disappointment. Men who are genuinely eating don't waste the breath. Decker came in and served himself and sat down across from Cutter and tasted the molasses corn first. She watched him do it, watched the deliberate way he moved the spoon, the slight pause before he swallowed, and then he looked up and found her across the room and gave her a small, single nod. Not enthusiastic, honest, which was worth considerably more. Jonah had taken a seat at the near end of the table. He wasn't eating yet. He was watching the room the way she had been watching it, doing the same quiet accounting she was doing, noting who reached for a biscuit first and who went back to the beans before finishing what was already in the bowl. He caught her eye once and looked quickly away, like a person caught doing something private. The room was still mostly quiet, which was the thing she had been counting on, and the thing she hadn't been entirely certain would happen, because you can't predict a room the way you can predict a recipe. A recipe has constants. A room full of hungry, skeptical men is a variable with its own momentum, and she had learned over 28 years that sometimes a good meal hits a bad mood and slides right off it without leaving a mark. But this was not that room. This room was changing. She could feel it the way you feel a shift in weather. Not seeing it exactly, just the quality of the air becoming something different than it had been. And then Garrett Sloane walked in. He came through the door last, which she suspected was deliberate. A man like Sloane did not drift. He positioned, and coming in last meant he could see the whole room before anyone could see his reaction to it. He stood for a moment in the doorway looking at the table, looking at the men eating, and his face was doing the particular careful work of a person who has made a public prediction and is watching it not come true. He picked up a bowl. He served himself smaller than anyone else had. She noted this. the careful, minimizing portion of a man who wants to be able to say he barely tried it if it becomes necessary. He sat down in the middle of the bench and put his spoon in the beans and ate. Marin did not watch him the way she'd watched the others. She gave him the privacy of her peripheral vision and focused her main attention on the room as a whole, on the biscuit pan, which was emptying faster than she'd calculated, on the bean pot, which was going to need to stretch further than she'd planned because 3 of the men had already gone back for more, and the pot was not bottomless, on the small logistical crisis of a successful meal that nobody warned you about in advance, that when people actually eat, they eat more than you expected, and the math changes. Is there more of the corn? It was Cutter. He had finished everything in his bowl and was holding it up slightly, not demanding, just asking, with the straightforward simplicity of an older man who has been eating at communal tables long enough to know that you ask or you don't get. There is, Marin said, and went to the pot and brought it to him and served him herself because the pot was heavy and he was older than she'd initially clocked. Closer to 60 than 50, she thought, with the particular stillness of a man whose body had been through enough that it had learned to conserve. He watched her ladle the corn into his bowl. "Where'd you learn to cook corn like this?" he said. "A woman named Ada Ferris," she said. "She was traveling with a group out of Missouri in '71. She'd been doing it her whole life, and I watched her do it twice and then did it myself until I had it." "Molasses," Cutter said. "Just enough." Ada Ferris knew what she was doing. "She did," Marin said. "Most people who've been cooking their whole lives do, and most of them never get credit for it." She moved the pot back to the range and turned to find that the room had shifted again. Slightly, subtly, the way a conversation shifts when something true gets said in it, and everyone hears it but nobody acknowledges it directly. A couple of the men were looking at her now rather than at their food, not with the aggressive attention of the yard, but with something quieter, something that was beginning, just beginning, to look like consideration. She had been waiting for that. What she had not been waiting for, and what caught her off guard in the specific way that things catch you off guard when you've been so focused on what you expected that you missed what was actually coming, was the sound of Sloane's spoon hitting the table, not dropping, setting down, deliberately. The sound was small, but it cut through the room the way small, deliberate sounds do, and several men looked up. Sloane was staring at his bowl. His jaw was working slightly, the way a man's jaw works when he is chewing on something other than food. His expression had lost the performance quality she had cataloged earlier. What was underneath it was less certain, less arranged, more like the actual face of a man rather than the version he showed the yard. Nobody said anything. Then Sloane picked his spoon back up and finished his beans. It was such a small thing. It was everything. Marin turned back to the range and busied herself with the pot so that no one could see what happened to her face for the next 30 seconds, which was private and hers and not for the table. The conversation started slowly, the way conversation always starts when a room has been quiet through a meal. First one voice, then another answering it, then a third on a different thread, and within 10 minutes the dining room of Blackbriar Ranch had more sound in it than Jonah Pike, watching from his end of the table, had heard in weeks. He would think about this later. He would think about how you don't notice the quiet accumulating until something breaks it and you realize how heavy it had gotten. Decker was telling someone about a horse he'd been having trouble with, a bay mare that had been refusing the south pasture gate for 3 weeks without any apparent reason, just stopping 20 feet out and planting herself and refusing all persuasion. Normally, this would have been a 5-minute complaint and then silence. Tonight it became a conversation, with Cutter offering a theory about the gatepost and another man named Briggs saying he'd seen similar behavior on a ranch in Texas, and what fixed it was moving the gate 6 inches to the left, and Decker saying that was the most ridiculous thing he'd ever heard, and then asking how far to the left. Marin listened to this while she worked the cleaning of the kitchen, which she started immediately because a kitchen that sits dirty after a meal becomes twice the work in the morning, and she had never been the kind of cook who left that problem for future herself to solve. She scraped the pots, poured the wash water, worked the iron with the rough cloth she kept for that purpose, and listened to the room she'd cooked into being. Jonah appeared at the kitchen door. "They're going to want more biscuits," he said. "The biscuits are gone," she said. "I know, but they're going to want them anyway." He paused. "Briggs asked me if you had any." "Tell Briggs that biscuits are a one-time event at supper, and anything made after the fact is a different and lesser thing. And I won't put my name on it. Jonah looked at her. I'm not telling him that. Then tell him no. He almost smiled. What should I actually say? Tell him I'll make more tomorrow. She stopped. The word tomorrow had come out of her mouth with a certainty she wasn't sure she'd earned yet, and she felt it land in the air between them. Tomorrow was not a guaranteed thing. Tomorrow was contingent on a decision that hadn't been made yet and wouldn't be made until Mercer decided it, and Mercer hadn't spoken to her since he'd stood in the kitchen door and asked her why she needed this place. Jonah heard the word land, too. He didn't say anything about it. I'll tell him there might be more tomorrow, he said, which was the kind of diplomatic translation that suggested he was more perceptive than his age recommended. He went back to the table. Maren finished with the pots and started on the range surface, and she was working on a stubborn spot near the back burner when she heard the shift in the room again. The particular drop in ambient noise that happens when someone says something that requires the surrounding conversation to stop and take note. She turned. Garrett Sloane was standing up. He was not a man who sat when he wanted to be heard. She understood that immediately. He stood because standing gave him height, and height gave him the room's attention. He had his bowl in one hand, held slightly out to his side, and he was looking down the table with an expression that she could not read from her angle. Holloway, he said. The room was quiet. She came to the kitchen doorway and stood in it. Mr. Sloane. He looked at her. His jaw did the working thing again, the internal chewing that preceded words he wasn't accustomed to saying. Around the table, eight men were holding very still in the specific way people hold still when they sense something is about to happen that they'll be talking about later. This was a decent meal, Sloane said. The words came out flat and clipped, the way words come out when they're being forced through a space that doesn't want to let them through. She could see what it cost him. She had spent enough time around men like Sloane to understand that the structure of his identity was built on being right in public, and what he'd predicted in public, loudly, confidently, for the benefit of the whole yard, had not come true. And every man at that table knew it, and he was standing up in the aftermath of that and saying something he would rather not say, and she wasn't going to make it easy for him, but she also wasn't going to make it worse. Thank you, she said. I said some things in the yard, he said. He stopped. You did, she agreed. Another pause, longer. His eyes moved briefly to the table and then back to her. Those things were based on how you looked coming in, not on what you could actually do. Most first impressions are, she said. That's why they're usually wrong. He looked at her for a moment, really looked, the way he hadn't in the yard, without the performance of it. Just a man looking at another person and arriving at a conclusion that surprised him. I judged you on your boots, he said. It came out almost like a question. You judged me on my boots, she confirmed, without heat, without triumph. Just the fact of it, set down between them like an object on the table. Something in his shoulders shifted, not a collapse. Garrett Sloane was not a man who collapsed, but a small, almost imperceptible relinquishing of something he'd been holding rigid. He set his bowl on the table. I was wrong to do that, he said. The room was so quiet she could hear the fire ticking in the range. Cutter, at the end of the table, picked up his spoon and tapped it once on the edge of his bowl. A sound like a small bell, brief and clear. Decker nodded once. The young hand who'd loaded his bowl too full looked between Sloane and Maren with the wide attention of someone watching something he'd never seen before and instinctively understood was worth watching. Maren stood in the doorway with her cleaning cloth in her hands, and she looked at Garrett Sloane, who was not easy and was not comfortable and was not performing anything for anyone at that moment. And she thought about the bundle in the dirt and the laughter in the yard and the long walk that morning and every place she had cooked and been left behind. She thought about what it would feel like to make this smaller than it was, to find a sharp edge in it and use it. She put the cloth down on the work table behind her. I appreciate that, she said, straightforwardly. Not with warmth, exactly. Not yet. There wasn't enough history for warmth. But without distance either, like a person accepting something real that was offered real. It takes something to say it. Sloane looked at her for another moment. Then he sat back down, which was also something, because sitting down was relinquishing the floor, and Garrett Sloane did not often relinquish the floor. He picked up his bowl and held it out toward the center of the table. "Is there any more in the pot?" he said. Decker started to say something and then stopped himself, and Marin could see him physically choose not to comment, which was probably the wisest thing he had done all week. Cutter was looking at the ceiling with great interest. Jonah Pike was looking at his hands with a smile he was working hard to keep contained. "I'll check the pot," Marin said. She went back into the kitchen. She picked up the ladle and looked into the bean pot, and there was enough, barely, enough for one more serving for a man who'd had one already. She ladled it into a clean bowl and carried it back to the table and set it in front of Sloane and picked up his empty bowl without ceremony, as if this were simply the ordinary continuation of a meal, which, she had decided, it was. He nodded once. She returned to the kitchen. She stood at the work table in the sudden privacy of it and put both hands flat on the wood and breathed. Her heel was throbbing. Her back, which she had been ignoring for hours, had made itself known during the standing and ladling of the past 40 minutes with a low, sustained complaint that she was now allowing herself to feel because the meal was done and the work was done, and there was nothing left to hold herself together for at the immediate moment. She had done it. She had fed them. All of them. With what had been, at the start of the afternoon, approximately nothing. A near-empty larder, a failing ranch, a room full of men who had expected her to fail. She had made something out of what was there, which was all cooking had ever been, when you stripped away the fancier explanations. She heard the dining room behind her, the voices continuing, the meal becoming something that didn't end when the food ran out but kept going in the particular way a good meal does, extending itself into conversation and laughter and the general loosening that comes when people have been fed and can let their guard down at least for the length of an evening. Laughter. She noted that specifically. She had been listening to this ranch since she walked through the gate, and she had heard many things, skepticism, mockery, the performative boredom of men waiting for something to fail. But she had not heard that. The sound of it was different from what had been in the yard this afternoon. That laughter had been about her. This laughter was not about anything in particular, which meant it was real. She found a stool she hadn't noticed before, shoved into the corner behind the door, and she sat down on it and took the weight off her feet for the first time since morning. Thaddeus Mercer appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had been in the dining room. She had seen him at the head of the table when she'd brought the corn out, eating with the focused quiet of a man who had more to think about than was comfortable. He came into the kitchen now and closed the door behind him, which was a formality but also a privacy, and he looked at her sitting on the stool and at the cleaned kitchen and at the empty pots on the range. "They're on their third conversation," he said. "That hasn't happened in a while." "Food does that," she said. "It's harder to be at odds with someone on a full stomach." He moved to the range and looked at the empty bean pot, then the empty corn pot, then the cooling biscuit pan with its residue of lard and flour dust. He looked at the clean work table. He looked at the empty herb nail and the scraped molasses jar lined up together on the shelf, which she had put there not quite consciously. It was just where she'd put them, the empty things grouped together like punctuation at the end of something. "You used everything," he said. "There wasn't much to leave," she said, "and I don't waste." He turned and looked at her directly. He was a man, she had observed, who looked at things directly when he was deciding about them, and who looked away when he was managing something he hadn't decided yet. He was looking at her directly now. "I'd like to talk terms," he said. She had been expecting this, had known it was coming since Cutter's face over the first spoonful of beans, since the silence of the room, since Sloane's second bowl. And yet hearing it said plainly still required her to take one careful breath before responding. "All right," she said. "I can offer room and board and a fair wage," he said. "What I can't offer is much. The ranch has been in a lean stretch. You can see that." "I've been in lean stretches before," she said. "I know." "I'd need you to do more than cook." He paused. "I'd need you to help figure out what we have and what we need and how to make it through to spring without losing more men than I already almost lost. I don't have a housekeeper. I don't have anyone managing the domestic side of this place. It's been running on improvisation for 6 months. Marin thought about the kitchen as she'd found it, the empty shelves, the forgotten herbs, the salt pork end sitting in the shadow where no one had thought to look. She thought about what she'd seen of the bunkhouses from the outside, and about the general quality of a place that had been without someone paying attention to it for too long. "I'd need to see the full inventory," she said, "whatever stores are left, wherever they are. And I'd need to know the honest situation with the money for resupply." His mouth tightened slightly. "The honest situation is uncomfortable." "I've managed uncomfortable situations before," she said. "I'd rather know what I'm working with than find out when it becomes a crisis." He looked at her for a moment, and something in his face settled. Not relaxed. Thaddeus Mercer was not a man who relaxed easily. She was already certain of that. But resolved. Like a man who has been carrying a weight alone and has just been offered a second pair of hands and is deciding whether he trusts the offer. "Fair," he said. "I'll pull the account books tomorrow. And I'll need the kitchen to be mine," she said. "Not in a difficult way, but if I'm managing the stores and the cooking and what comes in and out of this kitchen, I need to be the one making those decisions. I can account for every ounce I use and every penny I spend, but I need the authority to spend it." Henny didn't like that kind of accountability, Mercer said. "I'm not Henny," she said. He almost smiled again, the same almost as before, the suggestion rather than the thing. "No," he said. "You're considerably not Henny." They stood in the kitchen, or she sat and he stood, in a quiet that was different from all the quiets that had come before that day. Not the challenging quiet of the yard, not the waiting quiet of the dining room, something simpler than either. Two people in a kitchen after a meal, the kind of quiet that forms when the business of the day has found some kind of ground. "There'll be pushback," he said. "From Sloan." "I expect so." "He's not a bad man," Mercer said. "He's a man who's been in charge of a place that's been falling apart, and he's been holding it together with his own certainty because that was the only tool he had. It makes people defensive." "I know what it makes people," she said. "I've cooked for a lot of them." She paused. "He apologized at the table tonight, in front of the full crew. That's not nothing." Mercer looked at her steadily. "No," he said. "That's a great deal from Garrett Sloan." "So maybe we give him the chance to be something other than what he was this afternoon," she said. "Same as you gave me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a generous way to see it." "It's a practical way to see it," she said. "A ranch runs on whether its people can work together. I've seen enough places fall apart to know that the personalities matter as much as the land or the cattle." She looked at her hands, still slightly stiff from the morning's walking and the afternoon's work. "I'm not here to make enemies, Mr. Mercer. I'm here to make supper. If those two things can coexist, we'll all be better off." He was quiet for a moment longer. Through the door she could hear the dining room still going, a specific laugh she was beginning to identify as Decker's, a lower sound that was probably Cutter adding something dry, and under it all, the comfortable rumble of people who have stopped watching their words as carefully as they had been. "My wife used to say something like that," Mercer said. He said it simply, not with grief exactly, though she heard the underside of it. She didn't ask. Some things you don't ask about right away. Some things you let a person offer in their own time, if they choose to offer at all. "She sounds like she was a sensible woman," Marin said. "She was the most sensible person I ever knew," he said. "I've been failing to be half as sensible as her for 6 years." He said this without self-pity, which she respected. He was stating a fact he'd lived with long enough to have worn the sharp edges off it. "Well," she said, "that's what people tend to do when someone sensible leaves. They muddle." "We've been muddling significantly," he said. "I can see that." She looked around the kitchen, her kitchen. She was already beginning to think of it that way, which was either confidence or the beginning of a foolishness she would only know later. "We can start unmuddling it in the morning. First thing I'll need is that inventory." He nodded. "First thing." He moved to the door, then stopped with his hand on the frame. "Holloway," he said. "Yes." "Those were good beans." She looked at him. "Those were your last beans," she said. "So they had to be." He left. She sat on the stool a little longer. The kitchen was cooling now, the range dying back to embers, the work heat of the afternoon dissipating into the ordinary temperature of an Oklahoma summer evening. Her heel had settled from a throb to a dull, manageable ache. Her back was still complaining, but at a volume she could talk over. She thought about the morning, how long ago it felt. The walk in the heat, the last half biscuit, the creak of the gate, the weight of her bundle hitting the dirt. She thought about standing in the yard with 8 men's laughter on her, and her hands still, and her chin level, and the thought, clear and cold and very quiet, that she was going to cook the best meal this ranch had seen in years, and she was going to do it with what she had, and they were not going to be able to say a single thing about it afterward. She had done that, not elegantly, not without the stiffness in her knuckles or the bad knee or the near crisis of the biscuit timing, or the moment of pure stubbornness that had gotten her through the onion portion when the heat and the hunger and the fatigue had all converged into a wall she'd had to push through without showing anyone she was pushing. Not perfectly, but done. She got up off the stool and took one last look at the clean kitchen, the empty pots, the nail where the herbs had been. Tomorrow she would need new herbs. She would need to take inventory of what the cellar held, if there was a cellar. She would need to talk to Mercer about what they could afford to bring in before the summer was fully out, and the supply wagons from the east became unreliable. She would need to figure out Sloan, and the young hand whose name she still didn't know, and what the ranch's rhythm was, and what the men needed beyond food. Because a cook who pays attention knows that what people eat and how they eat, it tells you things about what else they're missing, and she had been reading tables her whole life. She had a great deal of work ahead of her. She picked up her travel bundle from where she'd set it under the work table hours ago, when she'd first come in and started learning the kitchen. She looked at it for a moment, the bundle she'd carried from place to place for years, from wagon train to mining camp to cattle drive to wherever was next. The bundle that Sloan had thrown in the dirt. She set it back down under the table. She wasn't carrying it anywhere tonight. She found a lamp, trimmed the wick, lit it from the last of the range's embers, and carried it with her out of the kitchen and into whatever came next. The account books were worse than she'd expected. Mercer had laid them out on the kitchen table the next morning before anyone else was up. 3 ledgers, 2 of them so full of corrections and crossings out that the pages looked like they'd been through an argument with themselves. He sat across from her with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking and watched her read through them with the expression of a man who has been dreading this moment for some time and is relieved, in a complicated way, that it has finally arrived. She didn't say anything for a long while. She turned pages. She ran her finger down columns of numbers, noting where the corrections clustered, June and July mostly, which told her something about when things had started to go seriously wrong rather than just routinely wrong. She noted the feed costs against the cattle count and did the arithmetic in her head and arrived at a number that explained a great deal about the lean kitchen she'd walked into the night before. "The summer was hard," Mercer said when the silence had gone on long enough. "The summer was hard, and the spring wasn't much better," she said without looking up. "You've been running this place on less than it needs since March." "February," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "February is when I started moving money from one column to cover another," he said. "March is when I stopped being able to pretend that was a temporary measure." She looked back at the ledger. February. 6 months of managed decline, of watching a thing you'd built erode in front of you and not having enough hands or money or luck to stop it. She had seen it before, on wagon trains that started the season underfunded, on cattle operations that got hit by weather or disease in years when the margin was already thin. There was a particular quality to the face of a person who had been managing that kind of slow disaster, a careful flatness around the eyes, a practiced neutrality that was exhausting to maintain. She had seen it in Mercer's face the first moment she looked at him on the porch. She understood it better now. "All right," she said. She closed the ledger. "Here's what I can see from these numbers, and then I'll need you to tell me what I can't see from them." He nodded. "You have enough in the cattle to come back from this if you don't lose more animals and if the fall market holds," she said. "That's not my area. That's yours and Sloan's. What is my area is that you've been overspending on food supplies relative to what you're actually doing with them, which means either the previous cook was wasteful or there's been spoilage you haven't been accounting for, or both." "Both," Mercer said. "I suspected." She opened the 3rd ledger, the one with the supply orders. "You've been buying white flour when you could be stretching it with cornmeal. You've been buying canned goods that I can make from scratch for a quarter of the cost if I know what's available locally. And you haven't been buying salt in sufficient quantity, which means you haven't been preserving anything, which means you've been losing food to spoilage that you could have been holding against a harder season. Mercer looked at her. Henny wasn't a preserving cook. Henny wasn't a planning cook, she said. He was cooking the day he was in and not thinking about the day coming. She set the ledger down. I think differently about that. So I'm beginning to understand. She folded her hands on the table. I need to know what's available within a half-day's ride of here in terms of wild food. What grows, what can be gathered, what the land offers that you haven't been using. And I need to know where the nearest town is with a dry goods supply and what the wagon schedule looks like before winter closes the roads. Mercer considered this. There's a town called Harlan's Creek, 12 miles east. Supply wagon comes through from Tulsa every 3 weeks in summer, less in fall. Last run before winter is usually mid-October, sometimes late if the weather holds. What's the date today? August 14th. She did the calculation. 8 weeks, perhaps 9, before the last supply wagon. She looked at the ledger numbers again, and then looked at the window and the flat, sun-beaten yard beyond it, and did a different kind of arithmetic. The kind that didn't involve numbers, but involved what she knew about Oklahoma winters, about how quickly a ranch could find itself cut off, about how many people she was now responsible for feeding through a season that did not negotiate. I need to go into Harlan's Creek, she said. This week, if possible. I need to see what they carry and what I can establish a credit arrangement for, and I need to start building stores before the end of August. I can take you Thursday, he said. I'd rather go sooner. He looked at her steadily. Wednesday, then. Wednesday, she said. She stood and went to the range and began the business of breakfast, which was what came next regardless of what the ledger said, because the men would be up within the hour, and a ranch that had eaten well the night before was going to arrive at breakfast with an appetite shaped by the expectation of more of the same, and she intended to meet that expectation within the limits of what remained in the larder. It was while she was working the breakfast fire that Sloane came in. He came in the way he had come in the yard the previous day, with the step of a man accustomed to being the first authority in a room. But he checked himself at the kitchen door in a way that was small and almost invisible, a half-second pause that recognized the room was already occupied and occupied purposefully. She noted it without commenting on it. Mercer, he said, acknowledging the owner. Then, after a beat, Holloway. Mr. Sloane, she said, without turning from the range. He poured himself coffee from the pot she'd already started and leaned against the far wall with his cup. He was doing the thing men do when they want to be present without being visibly involved, watching from a neutral position, gathering information while appearing merely to drink their coffee. She wants to go into Harlan's Creek Wednesday, Mercer said. Sloane looked at her back. For what? Supplies, Mercer said, and to set up an account. We already have an account at Harlan's Creek. She wants to look at it herself, Mercer said. A pause. She could feel Sloane deciding whether this was a challenge to something. She continued working the range, splitting her attention between the conversation and the skillet she was getting up to temperature. She had bacon she'd found in the cellar the previous evening, half a side, older but solid, nothing that proper heat wouldn't address, and dried potatoes she was reconstituting in the water left from last night's beans. Seems like an extra trip, Sloane said. It seems like necessary information, she said, still not turning. I can't plan a winter larder for a ranch I don't know yet. I need to see what the supply situation actually is, not just what's written in a ledger. Another pause. The ledger is accurate. I'm sure it is, she said. It also doesn't tell me whether Bill Harlan carries dried apples or only fresh, or whether his salt supply is the coarse kind or the fine, or whether his last flour shipment is the winter wheat or the spring variety. Those things matter for what I'm planning, and I can't know them without going. Sloane was quiet. She heard him drink his coffee. Fine, he said. I'll drive. She turned around then, because she wanted to see his face when she said the next thing. I'd rather take Jonah, she said. You're more useful here. 12 miles both ways is a day, and you're the one who knows what needs doing on the ranch. She had thought carefully about this. It was true. Sloane was more operationally valuable at the ranch than on a supply run, but it was also true that 12 miles in a wagon with Garrett Sloane was a day she did not currently have the energy for, and that sending him the message that she respected his role at the ranch while also not needing him to supervise hers was a message worth sending clearly and or early. He looked at her. She held his gaze without difficulty. "Jonah's got work here Wednesday," he said. "Then give him something else Thursday," Mercer said. "We'll go Thursday." Sloane looked at Mercer, then back at her and made the calculation she could see him making, whether this was a hill, and arrived at the correct answer, which was that it wasn't. "Thursday," he said, and finished his coffee and left. Mercer looked at her. She had turned back to the range. "You handled that well," he said. "I gave him something he could agree with," she said. "People like Sloane need a way to agree that isn't the same as backing down. If you take that away from them, they dig in, and everyone loses time. You've managed men like him before." "I've managed all kinds," she said. "Sloane's not the worst. He knows what he's doing out there on that range. He just hasn't had to make room for someone doing something equally necessary inside." The bacon went into the skillet and immediately began to tell everyone in the building that breakfast was happening, which was its own kind of announcement and far more effective than any bell. The weeks that followed moved with the particular rhythm of a place finding its footing again. It was not a smooth process. Smoothness would have required everyone to adjust simultaneously and gracefully, and people don't work that way. They adjust in bursts and holdbacks, 2 steps forward and then a sideways step while they figure out if they still know where they are. Sloane and Marin found their working distance gradually, through a series of small negotiations that were never explicitly named as negotiations. He stayed out of the kitchen. She stayed out of the operational decisions about the cattle and the range. When something crossed between those two territories, which happened more than either of them would have predicted, they talked it through with a directness that was sometimes uncomfortable and always faster than going around it. She noticed, around the 3rd week, that he had started telling her things he hadn't been asked. Small operational details that affected the kitchen, the extra hand coming on for the fall, which meant an extra mouth, the plan to sell a portion of the herd before winter, which affected the cash available for supplies, the condition of the root cellar, which he mentioned in passing one morning and which turned out to be more significant than passing. The root cellar was her next project. Jonah showed it to her on a Thursday in early September, pulling back the heavy door set into the ground behind the main house and holding the lamp down into the cool dark while she descended the rough steps. She stood at the bottom and turned slowly and looked at what was there and what wasn't there, and began the kind of mental inventory that had become as natural to her as breathing. There was less than she'd hoped and more than she'd feared. The previous winter's remaining stores, a few things Henny apparently hadn't bothered to use, sat in the far corner, some still good, and some past it. She sorted through with her hands in the lamplight while Jonah held the light steady and watched. "How bad is it?" he said. "It's an opportunity," she said. He waited. "It's a significant opportunity," she said, which made him exhale a short laugh. She had been teaching him, in the way that teaching happens when you're not formally doing it, through the daily work of the kitchen, through the things she said aloud while she worked, and the things she expected him to figure out by watching. He had taken to it the way she'd expected from those first moments on the stool with the leather in his hands. He paid attention. He remembered things he'd been shown and applied them the next time without being reminded, which was rarer than people assumed. He was also, she had discovered, deeply curious about the land in a way that went beyond ranch work. He knew where things grew in the territory around Blackbriar that nobody else seemed to have thought about. Stands of wild plum in the creek bottom, patches of lamb's quarters and wood sorrel on the north slope, a variety of wild onion that came up in the meadow east of the south pasture every August without fail. "How long have you known about those wild onions?" she asked him one morning when he'd brought in a bunch of them for her, their roots still trailing soil. "Since my 2nd summer here," he said. "Cutter showed me. He grew up in this territory. He knows everything that grows." "Bring Cutter to me," she said. He looked uncertain. "Cutter doesn't really come to the kitchen." "He will if you tell him I want to talk about what grows on this land," she said. Cutter came that afternoon, lowering himself onto the stool by the door with the careful movements of a man managing a body that had more miles on it than was comfortable. He looked at her with those careful eyes, and she put a cup of coffee in front of him without asking and sat down across from him and told him what she needed. "I'm trying to build stores for the winter," she said. "Not just from what comes in on the supply wagon, From what's on this land and around it, what do you know that nobody's been using? He looked at her for a long moment, then he started talking. He talked for nearly 2 hours. She listened with the focused attention she brought to things that mattered, asking questions when she needed precision and letting him move at his own pace through the rest. He knew the creek bottom well: wild plum, chokecherry, persimmon that was bitter before the first frost and perfectly edible after. He knew the upland areas and what grew there through the seasons. He talked about the Osage women he'd traded with 20 years ago who had taught him things about this particular landscape that he'd never seen written in any book, and the way they'd preserved and stored and prepared things that the ranchers around them were paying wagon train prices to import from the east. "Why hasn't anyone used this?" she said when he paused. "Because nobody thought to ask," he said. Simply. Not accusingly, just the plain fact of a thing that had been sitting unused because no one had thought to look at it. She thought about that for a day, and then she brought it to Mercer, and Mercer authorized the time, and for the next 3 weeks, Marin and Jonah and Cutter, and eventually 2 of the other hands who had nothing better to do in the afternoons while the range work wound down for summer, went out into the land around Blackbriar and brought back things that had been there the whole time. Wild plum, put up in jars with the minimum of sugar she could manage and still have them keep. Choke cherries, dried on flat boards in the sun. Persimmon, set aside in the cool of the root cellar to wait for the first frost, which would sweeten them into something worth eating. Wild onions, braided and hung in the kitchen where the air could get to them. Lamb's quarters, dried and crumbled, which added a green note to winter soups that the men would not be able to identify but would notice in its absence. Sloane watched this operation with an expression she couldn't entirely read through September. He didn't comment on it directly. He redirected men to it when she asked for extra hands, which was the practical endorsement rather than the spoken one. Once, coming in from the range in the late afternoon, he passed the group of them returning from the creek bottom with a basket of choke cherries and a crate of plum, and he stopped his horse and looked at the loaded wagon and at Cutter sitting on the bench, and he said, "Cutter, did you know about those plums the whole time?" "Yes," Cutter said. Sloane looked at the loaded crate for a moment. "Huh," he said, and rode on. She heard Jonah, walking beside the wagon, make a sound that was almost a laugh. October came in on a northwest wind that everyone on the Oklahoma Territory felt in their bones before they looked at the sky. The summer's heat broke in a single week, replaced by a cool that had an edge in it. Not winter yet, but winter's announcement, the kind of weather that said to anyone paying attention that the preparation window was closing. Marin paid attention. She drove Mercer harder about the supply order than she'd driven him about anything else since arriving, because she had done the arithmetic 3 times, and the number she kept arriving at was the same number. And the number told her that what they'd gathered from the land was essential but not sufficient, and that what they bought in Harlan's Creek before the last wagon of the season needed to be right, or they would be eating through their margins by February. "You want to spend more than I've budgeted," Mercer said, looking at the list she'd put in front of him. "I want to spend more now so we don't spend twice as much in March, when we're desperate and the nearest supply is in Tulsa," she said. He looked at the list. She had done the work. Every item had a reason beside it, the quantities justified against the number of mouths and the number of months and the projected losses to cold and use. It was not a guess. It was a document. "The salt," he said. "This seems like—" "You're going to have a side of beef and 2 hogs before the snow hits," she said. "Salt is how you keep them through February. If you buy too little now, you'll be smoking meat you can't properly cure and serving the men rancid pork in January, and that's if you're lucky." He looked at her. "How do you know we're slaughtering before the snow?" "Sloane told me," she said, "last week. He mentioned it in passing, and I don't think he realized I was going to use it for planning purposes, but I did." Mercer looked faintly amused. "Does Sloane know you're planning around things he says in passing?" "Sloane and I have an understanding," she said. "I don't tell him everything I'm doing, and he doesn't tell me everything he's thinking, and we meet in the middle when it matters." He signed the order. The last supply wagon came through on the 18th of October. She was at Harlan's Creek before it arrived, having talked Mercer into leaving the night before and sleeping at the rooming house above the dry goods store, so she was first in line when the wagon rolled in at dawn. She spent 3 hours working through the wagon's inventory with the particular focus of a woman who has done the math and knows exactly what she needs and in what order of priority. And she loaded the Blackbriar wagon herself, organizing the weight distribution, calculating what would shift on the 12-mile road back. The wagon driver, an older man named Pell, who had been running the Tulsa to Harlan's route for 14 years, watched her work and eventually said, "You supply for a big outfit?" "Blackbriar Ranch," she said, "east of here." "Mercer's place?" "That's right." He was quiet for a moment. "Mercer's been a light order the last few years," he said. "This is a change." "Things are changing at Blackbriar," she said. He nodded slowly and went back to his manifest. She went back to her loading. The storm came in the second week of November. It did not announce itself the way October's cold had, not with a week of gradual change and atmospheric hints. It came in overnight, a full blizzard that laid 8 inches of snow across the Oklahoma Territory between dusk and the following noon, with wind that made the 8 inches feel like 20 and a temperature drop that turned the water in the yard pump to ice before anyone had gotten to breakfast. Maren had been up since 3 in the morning, not because she'd known exactly when the storm would come, she hadn't, but because she had been watching the sky for 2 days, and the sky had been telling anyone willing to look what it intended to do. She had told Mercer the previous evening that she thought they had one more day before a hard weather event, and she wanted the water barrels in the kitchen filled and the firewood moved inside and the cattle in the near pasture brought in if possible. Mercer had told Sloan. Sloan had thought it was excessive and said so, and then done it anyway because Mercer had told him to, and because, she suspected, some part of Sloan had started paying attention to what she said even when he disagreed with it. The barrels were full, the wood was inside, the cattle were in. She built the kitchen fire up before anyone else was awake and started the first of the things she would need to sustain everyone through what she now understood was going to be more than a one-day event. She had a pot of stock on before dawn, beef bones from the slaughter, which she had reserved and stored in the cold of the cellar exactly for situations like this. And the stock was the foundation of everything else, the deep, sustaining base she could extend with the dried vegetables and the preserved goods and the wild plum and the crumbled lamb's quarters in the jar on the high shelf. When the men stumbled in from the bunkhouse to the kitchen at their usual hour, they found the storm outside and the kitchen warm and something on the range that smelled like it had been going for hours, because it had. Decker stood in the kitchen doorway with snow on his hat and looked at the stove and then at her and said, "You knew." "I thought so," she said. "I wasn't certain. How long do you think we'll be stuck?" 3 days minimum," she said. "Possibly 5. Maybe more if the wind keeps up." She handed him a cup of the stock, plain, which he wrapped both hands around and held without drinking for a moment. "Which is why I need everyone to understand that what I have in this kitchen has to last, and I need to be the one deciding how it's rationed." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Sloan's going to have something to say about that." "Sloan can say whatever he likes," she said. "The math is what it is." Sloan did have something to say. He came in from a failed attempt to check on the far cattle, stopped by a wall of blowing snow 50 yards from the bunkhouse, and stood in the kitchen dripping and cold and looked at what was on the stove, and then at Maren, and then at the organized row of stores she'd moved from the cellar to the kitchen before the storm had fully closed in. "You moved everything up last night," he said. "The cellar door swells in wet weather," she said. "I didn't want to have to fight it when we needed things in a hurry." He looked at the stores. She saw him counting, the way a man counts things who is responsible for people, and has learned that counting is what you do when things are uncertain. His expression went through something. "Is this enough?" he said. His voice was different from its usual register, not softer exactly, but with the performance quality absent. He was asking a real question and wanted a real answer. "For how many days?" she said. "However long the storm lasts." "If I manage it, yes," she said. "Not generously, but enough." He held her gaze for a moment. "Then manage it," he said. And that was all. What followed was 3 days and 4 nights, during which Blackbriar Ranch existed as a closed world, 8 people inside it, the storm outside it, and Maren Holloway's kitchen between them and everything the winter wanted to take. She slept in 4-hour stretches, getting up to check the fires and the pots and the state of the wood supply, which she tracked with a care that the men noticed, and that Jonah, on the second day, started helping her with without being asked, appearing at 2 in the morning to add wood and then standing in the kitchen while she checked the stock pot, both of them quiet in the sleeping ranch with the wind loud outside and the fire holding. "You're not scared," he said on the second night. "I'm a little scared," she said. "Of what?" She considered the honest answer. "Of the wood running out before the storm does," she said. "Of underestimating. I've been calculating this for months, and I believe the numbers are right, but you can't be certain until you're in it and finding out." He nodded slowly. "The plums," he said. "The wild onions and the choke cherries and all of it. You knew this was coming." "I knew something like this was always possible," she said. "Winter on the plains. It's not a surprise that it's hard. The surprise would be if it wasn't." He was quiet for a moment. "Cutter said you're the first person who ever asked him about the land like that," he said. "Like it had something to offer that we weren't using." She stirred the pot slowly. "Cutter knows this country," she said. "He's been reading it for 30 years. That's worth more than anything I could have bought in Harlan's Creek." "He said the same thing about you," Jonah said. "That you know how to use what's there, that you see what's already in a place instead of just what's missing." She didn't respond to that right away. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the building's boards and pushed through it with a thin, cold sound. The fire ticked. The pot breathed. "My mother was the one who taught me that," she said finally. "She could walk into a pantry with almost nothing in it and come out with something. I used to watch her and think it was a kind of, I don't know, a talent for seeing differently. Like she looked at a jar of dried beans and saw the meal that was in it rather than just beans." She paused. "It took me a long time to understand that wasn't special. It was just practice and patience and refusing to tell yourself there's nothing to work with before you've actually looked." Jonah was quiet for a while. Then, "I think you should stay," he said. "At Blackbriar. After the winter. Permanently." She looked at him. He was 19 years old, sitting on a stool in the middle of the night during a blizzard, saying something he'd clearly been thinking about for some time with the particular directness of a young person who hasn't yet learned to soften things. "That's not entirely your decision," she said. "I know," he said. "But if it was, I'd want you to stay." She turned back to the stove. "Get some sleep," she said. "I'll manage the fire until 4. He went. She stood alone in the kitchen with the storm outside and the sleeping ranch around her and the pot on the range that she had made from stock and preserved goods and wild-gathered food and careful math and months of refusing to wait for a disaster to arrive before she prepared for it. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind stopped. It didn't taper off gradually. It stopped, the way storms sometimes do on the Oklahoma plains, suddenly, completely, as if something had simply decided. The silence that followed was so absolute that Marin, standing at the kitchen window, felt it as a physical thing, the absence of noise filling the room the way sound had for the previous 3 days. She heard Sloane's boots on the porch, then the door and cold air, and Sloane standing in the kitchen with snow on his coat and something on his face that she had not seen there before. "The cattle are fine," he said. "Every one of them." "Good," she said. He looked at the pot on the range, which had held something in it for 4 straight days, replenished and adjusted and tended through the night and the day and the night again. He looked at the stores, which had been used but not exhausted. She had managed them exactly as she had said she would, enough without excess, the margin she'd calculated holding through 4 days without failing. He looked at her. "Holloway," he said. "Mr. Sloane." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him doing the same accounting she'd done the morning after that first supper, the accounting of what he'd thought would happen and what had actually happened and the distance between those two things. "The wild plum," he said. "It was good." She blinked. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not among them. "I'd been wondering about it," he said. "I didn't say anything, but when you added it to the pot the second morning, it was something different. Something I couldn't name." He stopped. "My mother used to put something like that in stew. When I was young. I hadn't tasted it in 30 years. She said nothing. Some things don't need a response. Some things need to be allowed to exist in the air for a moment without anyone reaching to do anything with them. Sloane looked at the window, at the white stillness outside. "We'd have been in real trouble without those stores," he said. "Yes," she said. "You started building them in August." "I started thinking about them the morning after I arrived," she said. He looked at her then, and the look was not the look from the yard, not the look from across the supper table, not any of the looks she had catalogued and filed over the months of learning to work alongside him. It was a simpler look, a man looking at something and seeing it clearly and acknowledging what he saw. "I threw your bundle in the dirt," he said. "You did," she said. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "So have I," she said. He nodded. He moved to the range and poured himself a coffee and stood with it and looked out the window at the stopped storm and the white world it had left behind, and he didn't say anything else, and she didn't either, and the kitchen held them both in the particular piece of a place that has done what it was supposed to do and is resting in the knowledge of it. Outside, the first sounds of the ranch coming back to life. A door, boots on snow, someone calling to someone else across the yard. She picked up the ladle and started thinking about breakfast. Spring came to Blackbriar the way it always came to the Oklahoma Territory. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with itself. Warm days followed by cold nights followed by rain that couldn't decide if it wanted to be sleet, the land thawing and refreezing in a cycle that went on for weeks before the ground finally made up its mind and stayed soft. Marin noticed it first in the kitchen. The light through the single window above the work table changed quality sometime in late February. Less flat, more angled, with an edge of warmth to it that the winter light had never had. She noticed it while she was working breakfast one morning, and she stood still for a moment with her hand on the skillet handle and just felt it on her face, that particular quality of returning light, and something in her chest did a thing she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter. The feeling of a person who has made it through something and is only now allowing themselves to know it. The winter had not been easy. After the blizzard in November, there had been 2 more hard freezes in December, one of them lasting a week, and a January that had been relentlessly gray and bitter, with a cold that got into the bunkhouse walls and stayed there. The wood supply had run lower than she'd wanted by February. The salt pork from the fall slaughter had held, but she'd had to be more careful with it than she'd planned because one of the hams had developed a problem in December that she'd caught early and cut around, and losing that portion had changed the math on the back half of the winter. She had managed. They had all eaten. No one had gone hungry in any serious way, which was the standard she'd set for herself on the morning after the first blizzard, when she'd stood at the window in the stopped storm silence and done a final accounting of what was left and what was still needed. By February, she understood that they were going to make it through. By March, she let herself believe it. The first morning that felt like real spring, not the arguing, provisional spring of February, but the thing itself, with birds making noise and the mud in the yard turning from frozen to simply wet, and the cattle moving differently in the far pasture, restless in the good way. Marin walked out the kitchen door before breakfast and stood in the yard and looked at Blackbriar Ranch in the early morning light. It looked different to her than it had in August. Not because the buildings had changed, they were still weathered, still leaning slightly in the same directions they'd always leaned, but because she was different in relation to them. In August, she had stood in this yard as a stranger assessing a place she might be allowed to stay in. Now she knew which board on the porch step would take your full weight and which one would flex and startle you if you hit it wrong. She knew that the east bunkhouse door stuck worse in wet weather than the west one. She knew that the water pump ran easier if you primed it with a cup of warm water first in cold mornings, and that the root cellar's east wall sweated in the spring thaw and needed checking. She knew this place the way you know a place you've been paying attention to. That was different from just living in it. Thaddeus Mercer found her standing there. He came out of the main house with his coffee and stood beside her on the porch step. The good one, without thinking about it, which meant he'd been navigating that step long enough that his feet knew, and looked out at the same yard she was looking at. "Cutter says the creek's running again," he said. "I know, I could hear it last night." He drank his coffee. The morning was cool, but the cool had a different character than winter's cold. Not pressing down, but opening up, the kind of temperature that made you want to be outside rather than in. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She waited. The ranch made it through the winter, he said. Not just survived. We're in better condition than we went in. He paused. That's not happened in 3 years. The fall market helped, she said. Because it had. The cattle had sold well in October, better than Mercer had projected, which had given the account some cushion she hadn't had in her supply calculations. The fall market helped, he agreed, and the supply management, and the stores, and the fact that we didn't lose men in November because they had reasons to stay. He stopped. I want to make the arrangement permanent, not just cook and housekeeper. I want you as a full partner in running this place, the domestic half of it. What comes in, what goes out, how we prepare for the seasons. Equal standing with Sloan on the operational side. She turned and looked at him. Sloan agreed to this? She said. A very slight pause. Sloan and I talked about it last week, he said. That's not the same as Sloan agreeing to it. He held her gaze with the steady look she'd come to recognize as his way of being honest without being comfortable. Sloan said it made sense, he said. That's as much agreement as Sloan gives most things. She thought about this. Outside, the creek sounds were just audible if you listened for them, a light, persistent murmur that had been absent for 4 months. She thought about what she'd told Jonah in the kitchen during the blizzard, that she'd started thinking about winter stores the morning after she arrived, before anyone had asked her to, before there was any guarantee she would be here to see them used. She thought about what it meant that she had done that, what it said about what she'd already decided without quite admitting it to herself. I want it in the ledger, she said. Whatever the terms are, I want them written down. I expected that, he said, and I want the kitchen authority to be explicit. Not an informal understanding. Written. Also expected. And I want Sloan to say it to my face, she said, not through you. I'm not asking for a ceremony, just a direct conversation between the two of us where he tells me himself. Mercer looked at her. That's the part he's not going to like. I know, she said. He'll do it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. How do you know? She picked up her coffee cup from the porch railing where she'd set it. Because Sloan's not the same man he was in August, she said. Neither am I. Neither is this ranch. She looked at the yard once more, at the mud and the weathered buildings, and the cattle just visible in the distance. That's what a winter does to people when they go through it together. It changes the accounting. She went back inside to start breakfast. Sloan came to the kitchen that afternoon. He did not knock, because Sloan did not knock on kitchen doors, but he came in with a slightly different quality of entry than usual. Not his full certainty stride, not the door owned by everyone casualness of the earlier months. Something in between. A man who was arriving somewhere he'd decided to be. Marin was working the afternoon bread, which was a thing she'd instituted in November, and which had become in the intervening months one of those quiet rituals that nobody explicitly valued until she thought about skipping it and found she couldn't. She looked up at him and waited. He stood in the middle of the kitchen. His hat was in his hands, which was unusual. Sloan generally kept his hat on indoors. Mercer told me what you asked for, he said. I figured he would. You want to hear it from me directly? Yes. He looked at his hat for a moment, not with discomfort exactly. Sloan didn't do discomfort in the way that looked like discomfort. He did it as a kind of stillness, a deliberateness, a man choosing his words before he used them. When you walked in here in August, he said, I had already decided what you were. Before you opened your mouth. Before you said what you were offering. He looked up at her. That's a particular kind of stupid, and I know that now, and I knew it the night of that first supper, but knowing it and saying it out loud are two different things, and I've been working my way toward saying it out loud since November. She had stopped working the bread. She was looking at him. I ran this ranch for 6 years as the man who kept things together, he said. That was my identity in this place, the one who held it when it wanted to fall. His jaw did its internal working thing. When you came in and started doing things I hadn't thought of, like the gathering, the stores, the winter prep, what I felt wasn't just wrong. It was personal. He stopped. It shouldn't have been personal. What you were doing was keeping us alive. But I made it about my territory instead of about the ranch. You came around, she said. Slowly, he said, reluctantly. He held her gaze without flinching from it. You have equal standing in how this place runs. The domestic half is yours. You make the calls, and I won't second-guess them, and I won't go around you." He paused. "That's what I came to say." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the creak was still audible, that persistent murmur of things returning to motion. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He was almost to the door when she said, "Sloan." He stopped. "You did hold this place together," she said, "for 6 years, in a lean stretch, with insufficient help and not enough money. That's not nothing. I should have said that before now." He looked at her over his shoulder. Something moved briefly in his face. Not softness, not the expression of a man receiving absolution, but the specific look of a person being seen accurately and finding it unexpectedly difficult. "Don't make it a habit," he said, saying things like that. "I probably won't," she said. He left. She turned back to the bread and worked it for a full minute without thinking about anything in particular, just her hands in the dough and the rhythm of it. And when she surfaced from that, she was surprised to find that her eyes were wet, which she hadn't noticed happening and which she was not going to examine too closely. She was 51 years old, and she had been moving her whole adult life, and she had just had a conversation that had not been possible 8 months ago, and the impossibility of it then, and the reality of it now was simply more than the eyes could process without some kind of release. That was all. She wiped them on her apron and kept working the bread. The spring settled into itself through April and into May, and Blackbriar Ranch settled into itself alongside it. Jonah had started formally learning the kitchen work, not as a helper, but as someone being trained in something deliberate. This had happened without a conversation about it, in the way the most important things at the ranch seemed to happen, through practice and proximity and gradual understanding, the student and the teacher finding their rhythm without ever explicitly naming what they were doing. He was not going to be a cook. She didn't think so, and she told him so plainly when he asked her one morning what she thought. "You're going to be someone who knows food," she said. "That's different from being a cook. A cook does this full time. Someone who knows food uses that knowledge in everything else they do. You'll run something someday, a ranch, something, and you'll know how to provision it, how to read a larder and understand what it tells you about the season, how to feed people in a way that keeps them." She shaped the bread on the table. "That's worth more than most things people spend years learning." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you know I'll run something?" "Because you've been watching how things work since before you could name what you were watching," she said. "People like that end up in charge of things eventually. The question is whether they know enough to do it well." He thought about that for a while. "You could have been in charge of things," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, the wagon trains, the camps, all those places. You were the one keeping them together, but you never—" He stopped, working toward what he meant. "Nobody made it official." She looked at the bread in her hands. "No," she said. "Why not?" She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated in the way honest answers about a whole life usually are. "Because in most of those places, making it official meant being a man," she said. "And in the ones where that wasn't strictly true, it meant being the kind of woman who was easy to see, young or pretty or connected to someone important. I was none of those things." She put the bread in the pan. "So I did the work, and other people had the title, and I moved on when I stopped being needed." Jonah was quiet for a long time. "Until here," he said. "Until here," she said. He nodded slowly, turning this over. "Do you think that's why it feels different?" he said. "Blackbriar. From the other places." She considered the question. It deserved consideration. "Partly," she said, "partly it's that this place needed exactly what I had to offer, and the timing was right for someone here to recognize that." She paused. "And partly it's that I stopped being willing to be temporary." "What changed?" "I got old enough that the math on temporary stopped working," she said. "If you keep moving, at some point the places you haven't been don't outnumber the places you've left behind. At some point you're not going forward anymore, you're just going." She looked at the window, the light coming through it with its changed spring quality. "I was tired of going." He absorbed this. Outside she could hear Cutter's voice in the yard. He was showing the youngest hand something, the way he'd taken to doing since the fall gathering, passing along the territory knowledge that he'd been carrying alone for years. She heard the young hand ask a question she couldn't make out, and Cutter's unhurried answer. That was something else that had changed. The question of the drifter came up in May. A man appeared at the gate on a Tuesday afternoon, younger than Marin had been when she'd walked in, but with the same particular quality of a person who had been walking in the heat for too long and had arrived somewhere out of necessity rather than choice. Dirty, thin, carrying a bundle that had seen better years, looking at the ranch with the calculating assessment of someone who has learned to evaluate a place's willingness before they ask anything of it. She saw him from the kitchen window. She went to the kitchen door and opened it and said, "Come in and sit down. I'll get you water and something to eat." She said it before anyone else had come out, before the dynamic of the yard could form itself into the thing it had been when she'd walked in. She said it simply, the way you say things that are not in question. The man looked at her with the particular caution of someone who has been turned away enough times to disbelieve an easy welcome. "I'm not asking for charity," he said. She recognized those words. They were hers, from 8 months ago, from the moment in the yard when she'd said them to Garrett Sloan and meant them as a statement of dignity rather than fact. "You're not getting charity," she said. "You're getting a meal. Come inside." He came in. Sloan appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, looked at the man sitting at the table with a bowl of the bean soup she'd had on the range, and looked at her with an expression that was a question. "He needs a meal and somewhere to rest," she said. "I told him he could have both." Sloan looked at the man, who was eating with the focused attention of someone seriously hungry. He looked back at her. "Does he need work?" he said. "Ask him," she said. Sloan sat down across the table from the stranger and asked him directly, with no particular gentleness but no particular hostility either, the practical directness of a man who has learned, slowly and not without resistance, that people deserve to be asked before they're decided about. The man's name was Wes Colton, and he did need work, and he had experience with horses, and he stayed. Mercer signed the terms the first week of June. He had drawn them up himself with input from Marin on the specific language around the kitchen authority and the provisioning decisions. And they sat together at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning with the document between them, and he walked through it section by section, and she read it in full before responding to any of it, which made him wait and which she suspected he respected rather than resented. "The language about the larder accounts," she said. "Is something wrong with it?" "The word consult is wrong," she said. "I don't consult Sloan on the larder accounts. I inform him of decisions already made, and he does the same with operational decisions that affect provisioning. Consulting implies I need his approval." Mercer looked at the language. "You're right," he said. He crossed it out and wrote something above it and showed it to her. "Better," she said. He made 2 other small corrections she asked for, and then they both signed it, and he put it in the ledger box where the ranch documents were kept, and she went back to whatever she'd been doing before, which was making notes for the summer supply order. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no ceremony to it. That was fine. She had spent enough of her life in situations where the dramatic version of a thing was offered instead of the real version, grand gestures that cost nothing in place of the practical acknowledgments that cost something. The document in the ledger box was the real version, and it was enough. She thought not for the first time about all the places she'd been the essential person without the acknowledged role. The wagon trains where she'd kept 20 families fed and healthy across 1,000 miles of hard country and arrived at the destination listed in the records as a passenger. The cattle drives where the cook's work was understood to be as critical as any other and paid at roughly half the rate. The mining camp where the manager had told her sincerely that she was the best cook he'd ever had, and then hired a man at twice her wage when the permanent position opened up. She did not think about these things with the hot, fresh anger of someone newly wronged. She thought about them the way you think about old weather. It happened. It was real. It shaped the terrain you're standing on now. What mattered more was the terrain. The terrain was Blackbriar Ranch in the summer of 1887. The terrain was a kitchen that was hers, a ledger with her name in it, a place that knew her well enough to need her specifically. The terrain was Jonah Pike learning to read a larder, and Cutter teaching the young hands what the territory offered, and Wes Colton, who had come to the gate hungry and been told to come inside and was now, 3 weeks later, proving to be as good with horses as he'd claimed and better with the cattle. The terrain was Garrett Sloan, who had not become a different person. He was still who he was, still the man who needed to be the first authority in a room, still the man whose initial instinct was to decide before he'd finished looking. But he was also the man who had stood in her kitchen with his hat in his hands and said the thing he needed to say without being asked twice, and who had spent a winter learning, against his nature, to trust someone else's expertise in the domain where it counted. People don't transform. She had learned that over 51 years. They accrue. They accumulate experience, and the experience either changes how they act or it doesn't, and the ones it changes are the ones worth staying close to. Not because they become perfect, but because their imperfection becomes something you can work with. On a Tuesday in late June, a woman appeared at the gate, older than Maren had been when she'd arrived, moving more carefully, with a bundle and the look of someone who has been traveling longer than is comfortable. She stood at the gate with her hand on the post and looked at the ranch with that particular evaluating quality of a person who has been turned away before and is calculating the odds. Maren was at the kitchen window. She went to the kitchen door and opened it. Sloan was already crossing the yard toward the gate, which was his instinct, and probably always would be, and she watched him get halfway there and then stop. He turned and looked at Maren in the doorway. She looked back at him. He turned to face the woman at the gate. "Come on in," he said. His voice was not warm. Sloan's voice was rarely warm, but it was straightforward, without the performance of the yard from last August, without the deciding before looking. "We've got a kitchen. You can get something to eat." The woman looked at him with caution, then at Maren in the doorway. The caution did not entirely leave her face, because caution does not entirely leave the face of someone who has learned that offers can be withdrawn. But she came through the gate. Maren held the door. The woman came into the kitchen and looked around at the organized shelves, the clean range, the herbs hanging near the window. A new bundle now, gathered from the same creek bottom and hillsides that Cutter had described in his 2-hour accounting the previous fall. She looked at the pot on the range and at Maren and at the stool by the door that was always available because Maren kept it there. "Sit down," Maren said. "I'll get you water and something to eat." The woman sat. She set her bundle at her feet with the careful deliberateness of a person who has been carrying something a long time and is not quite ready to believe they can set it down. Maren went to the range. She did not ask the woman what she could do or what she had to offer. She did not make the meal contingent on anything. A person sitting at your table after days of hard traveling does not need to audition for the right to eat. That was something she had decided a long time ago, in the way you decide things that come from having been on the other side of them. She served the meal and sat across from the woman while she ate and asked her one question. Eventually, when the woman had eaten enough that the edge of hunger had left her face, "Where are you headed?" The woman looked at her. "I don't know exactly," she said. Maren nodded. She understood that answer. She had given it herself, more times than she could count, standing in one place while looking at no particular next place and carrying the loneliness of that, the specific loneliness of a person in motion without a destination, which is different from any other kind of loneliness and harder to explain to someone who hasn't felt it. "Stay for a few days," she said. "Rest. We'll figure out the rest later." The woman looked at her with the same caution, and underneath the caution, the same thing Maren had felt in her own chest on the morning she'd stood in the yard of Blackbriar and watched Thaddeus Mercer come out onto his porch and look at her. Not hope, exactly. Hope was too fragile a word for what happened in that moment, something more like the first breath after holding it. The recognition that this might be, possibly, a place that would allow you to put something down. Outside, the summer was full and green and unforgiving in the way of Oklahoma Territory summers, and the ranch went about its work with the sounds Maren had learned over the past year like a language she now thought in. The cattle in the far pasture, the horse in the near barn, Cutter's voice somewhere in the yard, the creak of the porch step that gave under half weight. She went back to the range. She had bread to check and a stock pot to manage and a full kitchen to run, and the woman at the table who needed to eat and then to rest and then, maybe, if this place had something to offer her the way it had had something to offer Maren, to find a way to be useful in it. That was the ordinary work of a day. It always had been. Thaddeus Mercer came into the kitchen an hour later for his midday coffee and saw the woman at the table and looked at Marin at the range, and she met his eyes and he poured his coffee and said nothing, which meant he understood, which meant this was now simply part of how Blackbriar Ranch operated. She thought about what Jonah had said in the blizzard kitchen, sitting on the stool in the middle of the night. "I think you should stay." She had stayed. She had stayed, and the place had changed around her staying, or she had changed around it, or both things had happened simultaneously in the way that two people change each other through long proximity and shared difficulty without either of them being able to say afterward who changed first. She had stopped carrying her travel bundle to bed with her sometime around December. She couldn't remember the exact night. It had just stopped being the thing she did. It was under the kitchen work table now, where she'd left it the night of that first supper. She kept it there not because she needed it ready, but because she knew where it was, which was different. Knowing where the thing is and needing it immediately are not the same condition. One is caution, the other is fear. She had come a long way from one to the other. The bread needed turning, she turned it. The woman at the table finished her meal and sat quietly, not filling the silence with explanations or apologies the way people do when they're not sure of their welcome. She just sat and let the kitchen be what it was around her, and after a while her shoulders came down from where they'd been held, close to her ears, which is where shoulders go when a person has been braced for too long. Marin noticed this without comment. She knew what that looked like. She knew what it felt like when the bracing let go, when a place demonstrated through its ordinary behavior that you were not required to hold yourself together every single moment in anticipation of being turned out. It felt like the first morning you woke somewhere and did not immediately think about where you would go next. She had woken up like that for the first time in February, in the small room off the kitchen that Mercer had prepared for her in September, a narrow room with a window that faced east and a hook on the wall for her coat. And she had lain there in the gray early morning and realized that she was not calculating an exit. She was not taking inventory of what she'd need when the arrangement ended. She was just lying there, in a bed that was hers, in a room that was hers, in a place that was, as much as any place had ever been, home. She had gotten up and built the kitchen fire, the same as every morning, the ordinary continuation of a day that would be followed by another ordinary day, which was the most extraordinary thing she had experienced in 28 years of cooking for other people in places that were never quite hers. Blackbriar Ranch in the summer of 1887 was not a perfect place. Its books were still lean, its buildings still leaned. The men in it were still who they were, complicated, imperfect, carrying their histories the way people carry histories, with more weight than they usually admit to. Sloane still came into rooms with too much certainty. Cutter still said too little. Jonah was 19 years old with everything that implied. Mercer was a man still learning to trust again after years of managing alone, which was slow work and would be slow work for some time yet. She was not perfect either. She knew that. She was 51 years old with a bad knee and strong opinions and a tendency to start planning for winter in August, which was practical, but which also said something about a person who had spent too long unable to assume the next thing would come through reliably. She was working on that, in the way you work on things you learned in hard school. Slowly, with awareness of the old habit, trying to catch yourself before it becomes the only mode. It was enough. The imperfect place and the imperfect people and the ordinary daily work of feeding and preserving and making something from what was available. It was enough. It was she had come to understand what most good things actually looked like when you got close to them. Not the grand version, the daily version, the one that required showing up with your actual self and doing the actual work without waiting for conditions to become ideal. Conditions were never going to become ideal. She had understood that for a long time. What she hadn't understood until Blackbriar was that they didn't have to be. The bread was done. She took it out of the oven.